Thanks for joining us today for our Pay for Success 101 webinar. And thank you to the Kresge Foundation for continuing to be a partner with us on this PFS and higher ed work. My name is Alicia, and I'll be walking you through today's content. Just to level set on why we're all here, it was so great to meet many of you at NCAN last month during our provider advisory group kickoff. One thing we heard during that conversation was that you all wanted to learn more about Pay for Success as a tool for accessing public dollars. So we hope that this will be the start of that conversation and will be a resource for you moving forward. So on today's webinar, we'll provide a brief intro to third sector, an overview of Pay for Success financing. We'll discuss the opportunity to apply Pay for Success to achieve outcomes in the field of higher ed, and we'll share how we are exploring that idea through the Pay for Success and Higher Ed National Cohort and with our Provider Advisory Group. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and both the presentation and the recording will be shared with you afterwards. As you can see on the agenda, we've left time for Q&A at the end, but this is totally an informal setting, and we hope that this will be a learning opportunity for you, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat box or even unmute yourself throughout the presentation and chime in whenever you want to. So with that, we'll get started. This is our Pay for Success in Higher Ed Technical Assistance team. Hopefully our faces are familiar from last month. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, this is H.K. Howard. I'm Director out of the Boston office. Great to be with you all again and look forward to digging more into Pay for Success.
Yeah, hi everyone, this is Sarah Walton. I'm a Senior Associate in Third Sector's Boston office and also leading our state and system cohort work within this project.
And I'm Alicia, also based in the Boston office, and I'll be serving as the Provider Advisory Group point of contact. To briefly refresh on who we are, Third Sector is a national nonprofit that primarily works with government to change the way resources are connected to improved social outcomes. Pay for Success is just one example of how we are accelerating the transition to a performance-driven social sector. By taking what we call an outcomes-oriented approach to government contracting and the provision of social services, we're connecting financial resources, community-focused services, and robust data to ensure better outcomes for the people served. Our experience in implementing an outcomes orientation stems from a number of national projects. We've launched a third of Pay for Success contracts in the country. So it's still a pretty innovative concept, and we're continuing to explore the feasibility of Pay for Success in different sectors like higher ed. As many of you know, college-intending students who are low income, first generation, or students of color disproportionately experience poor matriculation, persistence, and graduation outcomes in their path to and through college. And as you know very well, there are a variety of wraparound student support services offered by providers like yourselves that are demonstrating success in achieving outcomes. Even so, many providers are currently funded by philanthropy, which is a limited resource and can make it hard to scale. The goal of this project and why we are all here today is to explore applying Pay for Success, or PFS for short, to higher ed. That is, to use public dollars to fund wraparound student support services to achieve student success outcomes. On this slide, you can see our 4 state and systems that are currently part of the cohort. We have Colorado's Department of Higher Education, Arizona State University, Connecticut State Colleges and Universities, and the Ohio Department of Higher Ed. You may have met some of these folks at our networking event, which was the first night of NCAN, and we'll share more about what the cohort has been up to and where they are right now later on in the webinar. And we've launched an RFI for college access and success providers this summer. And based on what we learned about all of you and the great work that you're doing, we were thrilled to invite 8 of you, so 8 providers who have a solid track record for achieving outcomes, to join the Provider Advisory Group. PFS requires multiple stakeholders, and providers are a critical one. We hope that bringing the provider perspective on what it takes not only to get students to and through college, but what it takes for a provider to contract with government and access public funding will inform this project moving forward. At the same time, we hope that participating in the advisory group provides you a better understanding of PFS as a path to sustainable public financing and understanding your organization's particular strengths and challenges to accessing this financing. We look forward to learning more about your organizations in the upcoming one-on-one calls that we have scheduled this and next week, so thank you all for moving so quickly on that logistically. And with that, we'll dig into Pay for Success as a contracting mechanism. So broadly speaking, Pay for Success is a contracting mechanism used to align stakeholders around outcomes. Given today's audience, we wanted to particularly highlight the benefits of PFS for providers, starting with unlocking public resources for more sustainable funding. Other benefits include, due to the nature of PFS focusing on long-term outcomes rather than short-term outputs, it lends itself to multi-year contracts, which can bring program sustainability. Second, the additional investment in a service can allow a provider to scale their impact. Third, with the focus on outcomes and not necessarily a prescriptive requirement on how they are achieved, providers have the flexibility to adjust their services to student needs. Fourth, Pay for Success requires data collection and analysis, which allows providers to either strengthen an existing evidence base or perhaps build a new evidence base. We understand that evaluation can sometimes be challenging to fund, so this is one way of building that in to the work. And having that evidence base is key to soliciting more private and public funding outside of a PFS context as well. And while not necessarily quantifiable, participation in PFS demonstrates to states and systems the imperative for them to invest public resources into student support services. We believe the ultimate success of a PFS project is if the government partner recognizes the value of the services they're piloting and they directly procure for them using existing funding streams moving forward, which ultimately benefits students.
Great. Thanks so much, Alicia. In just a minute, Alicia is going to walk us through an illustrative diagram to show how Pay for Success really comes to life. But before she does that, I'm going to take just a minute to talk about some of the basics of how Pay for Success differs from other contracting. Great. So let's start by considering traditional government contracting and its structure. In some cases, that's like a fee-for-service. This is what's represented on the left side of our screen. What we've learned is that often it's pretty one way. Government agencies often will see a need or they're more likely to have a mandate to fulfill. Many times public funding tends to pay for the same kinds of programs and services without much consideration on what outcomes are being achieved or what impact is being generated. Government will deploy dollars for a particular, maybe prescriptive service. Providers then receive this funding to deliver on the service. They collect data and report it back. Oftentimes that's for compliance purposes first and foremost. As you can see with the icons that make up part of this screen, they also made up that diamond that Alicia talked about with us earlier. These are really important levers, and in traditional government contracting, it can sometimes feel that those are all operating in silo. On the other hand, Pay for Success is a form of performance-based contracting, where an entity, oftentimes a government, agrees to pay for the outcomes achieved rather than on a fee-for-service basis. This contracting shift may involve new funding streams, they may be appropriated, to address specific and agreed-upon outcomes. Developing a Pay for Success contract also involves new stakeholders, such as private and philanthropic funders who may provide the upfront capital to providers who can deliver services to a very specific population. In many Pay for Success projects, This might be a provider who's testing a new service or adapting an evidence-based service to a specific beneficiary population who's experiencing an outcomes disparity. And data, rather than focusing solely on compliance, is shared between all stakeholders to ensure that outcomes are being met and to inform future learning and funding. And that really is what's represented on the right side of the screen. What third sector's learned is that just as much as this is about continuous improvement as it is funding. So for providers that are tuning into this webinar, particularly for providers who are interested in accessing and unlocking public dollars, we are really excited to test the application of Pay for Success in higher education. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but all in all, Pay for Success really helps align stakeholders to a common goal and to focus on longer-term outcomes. It's often used to scale what's working and to create sustainable public funding pathways that are coordinated, collaborative, and flexible.
Great. So speaking of stakeholders, we wanted to just note that the cross-sector nature of PFS is not just arbitrary. It's the result of intentional negotiation to ensure that the interests of and the incentives for all stakeholders are aligned under that common goal. Now I'm going to walk through a diagram of a sample Pay for Success project, which shows the major stakeholders and how they interact. Starting with the green box in the center is the systems level payer. This is often a public or system partner that identifies a critical social issue with historically poor outcomes or a disparity in outcomes for a particular population. As the end payer, they agree to repay private or upfront investments for services that are used to achieve positive outcomes. These investments are made by private funders, the blue box. This can include foundations, banks, businesses, impact investors. Thinking back to the slide comparing traditional government funding versus Pay for Success side by side, this is that private and philanthropic investment that is underwriting payments for services that Sarah mentioned. So upfront working capital provided by a third party is sometimes called a social impact bond. So you may have heard of that phrase, or SIB, S-I-B. That's the same thing as the upfront working capital that we're talking about here. The service provider is the light green box here, is the external provider that the systems level payer contracts with to deliver services to an identified high-risk population, which is in gray, in an effort to reach or exceed predetermined outcomes for success. The last stakeholder in this diagram is the evaluator in the dark gray box, who is measuring and reporting results back to all stakeholders. To reiterate what Sarah had shared, data is not just used to see if outcomes are actually achieved, they're also used for continuous learning to determine what's working, what can be tweaked in applications to the broader field. Lastly, to complete the financing structure, we have the red arrow on the top right, which shows the systems level payer repaying upfront funders when outcomes have been achieved. In summary, Pay for Success is a performance-based contracting system that aligns policy, dollars, services, and data to achieve outcomes and generate impact for a beneficiary population in need. And they can, but don't always or don't have to, involve third-party funding from private funders in the form of a social impact bond. I'll just pause here. Are there any questions about what we've covered so far before we dive into how this looks like in practice or how it's been applied in other case studies? Feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. Doesn't sound like anyone's chimed in, so we will keep going. So applying Pay for Success in practice. PFS can be applied to a range of social issues. On the screen are just 3 examples of PFS projects that third sector has worked on across the country. We're going to focus on the first one, the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Pay for Success project. So the background here is that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts noticed that youth aging out of juvenile corrections and probation systems were returning to jail or recidivating. With a criminal history and without formal job training, these youth were not finding stable employment, and they were returning to jail, which was both a huge financial cost to the state as well as a societal challenge. Traditional government contracts for workforce training programs weren't achieving the longer-term outcomes of sustained employment and preventing recidivism. So one reason why is due to the transient nature of this population. Without a long-term address or phone number, workforce development programs can't easily reach these youth. Since the programs are only reimbursed after an individual enrolls in services and not for all of the outreach efforts that it takes to get them enrolled, the program does not continue to track down and reach out to the youth. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts chose to pursue a pay-for-success contract for services in the hopes that trying something new would break the cycle of recidivism. PFS was an opportunity to use contracting to unlock public funding to find a better way to help this population. So to do this, the Commonwealth released an RFI and ultimately contracted with ROCA, a service provider, to increase employment and decrease recidivism for justice-involved youth in Massachusetts. The major stakeholders are the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is serving as the systems-level payer in the center of the slide. Private funders like Goldman Sachs, the Kresge Foundation, and Living Cities provided the upfront working capital to pay for services and would be repaid by the Commonwealth. As I mentioned, ROCA is the service provider who focuses on the hardest to reach justice-involved young men. And lastly, the Urban Institute in the gray box serves as the independent evaluator. Next, I'll dive into ROCA's service model and the metrics that were tracked as part of this project. ROCA's service model is a 4-year program. It involves 2 years of case management and life skills training and 2 years of ongoing support during employment. The service model was specifically designed to meet the needs of the youth. Going back to our example of the transient nature of this population, as just one example, ROCA is dedicated to relentless outreach, which is why engagement, just finding the youth and building that relationship of trust, is an entire 1 to 2 year process for them. The metrics that were tracked as part of this project included inputs like staff time, outputs like referrals and enrollments, short-term outcomes like the number of people who graduate from the program and the number placed in jobs, as well as long-term outcomes, looking at youth served 5 years later to measure employment and recidivism. While all of these metrics are tracked, the 3-starred metrics are the payment metrics, meaning that the Commonwealth would repay funders if targets for these outcomes are reached. One thing we wanted to highlight is the short-term payment outcome of sustained engagement. This is something that ROCA advocated for. Given the challenge of finding and engaging the youth in the first place, keeping them in the program and continuing that relationship and social emotional support was important to ROCA because they knew, based on their expertise with this population over the last some 30 years, that sustained engagement was key to achieving those longer-term outcomes. So this is one example of how ROCA was able to influence the project structure, and next I'll talk about other key decisions they were involved in. Unlike traditional government contracting, ROCA, as the service provider, was actively engaged in designing the PFS contract and uniting policy, dollars, services, and data. In terms of funding, they helped raise some of that upfront capital for the project, and this was also the longest term contract in their history. Because of that arrangement, they were able to scale and reach more young men. They also benefited from coordinated referrals from other stakeholders like county sheriff's offices and probation offices. In terms of outcomes, like I mentioned, they had a say in which outcomes they thought were most important to track and achieve for this population. Again, with their almost 30-year track record, they knew what this population really needs to thrive, and they were able to shape the project accordingly. To measure those outcomes, ROCA collected their own data, but they also coordinated to get administrative, employment, and incarceration data from the state to yield greater insight into the impact their services have even after they are no longer directly administering services to an individual. This project is ongoing, and today, which is 6 years in, ROCA continues to meet with stakeholders regularly.
Awesome. Thanks, Alicia. So as Alicia was walking through that Massachusetts example, you may have started to see why we were hypothesizing that higher education would be a great field to leverage pay for success in. As providers on this call, I'm sure you saw some of that come to life in your own work. I'm now going to transition us into why we're interested in applying the Pay for Success framework to higher education, specifically with some background on why we got started in the field, with whom, and where we are with our cohort today. Great, so similar to the example that we highlighted earlier, I'll note that Pay for Success is really designed to connect resources to results. And there's a real opportunity to use the mechanism to more systematically finance the wraparound student support services that are generating impact for underserved students. In all Pay for Success projects, no matter the issue area, there are a number of core elements or feasibility criteria that partners need to consider when developing a project. I'm going to show how these core elements connect to higher ed in order to explain a little bit more about why we are exploring Pay for Success with our cohort right now. So walking through this diagram, first, stakeholders are identifying a clearly defined student population experiencing outcomes disparities right now. So in higher ed, this might be looking at enrollment, persistence, and graduation outcomes gaps. Then, stakeholders align on contracting for a specific intervention or service model that is positively addressing the outcomes that the project aims to achieve. Next, rigorous evaluation, for example, of the intervention's impact is conducted. Results are collected, measured, and reported back to the project stakeholders to show that outcomes disparities have been reduced. And finally, in Pay for Success, as Alicia showed us in that last example, payments are linked to success in achieving particular outcomes. These are some of the core elements that we've been walking through with our cohort and how we're applying the framework in higher ed today. Before I share a little bit more about what we're doing with our current higher ed cohort, I wanted to just talk about how third sector got started in this space. The opportunity to apply Pay for Success actually started with some work we did related to a feasibility study with one of our provider advisory group members, USpire. I'm not sure if USpire was able to make the call today, but we did learn a tremendous amount by starting this exploration with providers. In fact, I'm going to talk to some of those key lessons that we learned in that work. The feasibility study, if you're interested in learning more, is linked at the bottom of the slide, and we'll be sure you get that at the end of the webinar. But we conducted several interviews with leaders from higher ed, including 2-year and 4-year institutions here in Massachusetts, as well as other student support service providers. Some of our key learnings were, 1, there is a clear need for additional support services, particularly among those who are experiencing some of the largest outcomes disparities, so our first-gen low income, namely students of color. Oftentimes, these students are experiencing a number of outside the classroom barriers, as you all know very well, that make their path to and through college more challenging. 2, there are many providers in the space providing evidence-based services that are effective. Everything from financial aid support to coaching, mentorship, helping with emergency needs. Providers like you are making a difference in helping close outcomes gaps in underserved communities. 3, we learned there is financial incentive for higher education institutions, such as Pell Grant funding or other tuition dollars coming along these students who are able to enroll and persist in their college journey. But there are also longer-term impact and successful life outcomes for students who are completing college. By recognizing this value for HEIs to invest in the success of these underserved student populations presents a really unique opportunity and has a positive cost-benefit analysis. And finally, while there are so many reasons for higher education to consider the benefits of developing pathways to public funding for these supports, funding for higher ed is declining almost universally. Current higher ed institution budgets in Massachusetts, and we know this to be true across the country, those budgets are squeezed. So even for HEIs who want to invest in student support services, the ability to pay for them is nearly impossible without the support of additional, potentially upfront financial resources that can be actualized in a pay-for-success model. Based on these findings, we launched the Pay for Success in Higher Ed cohort earlier this summer to help states and systems explore how they might fill the gap and fund wraparound student support services. From the feasibility work, I'll share we determined that states and systems, or likely those to play more of a systems-level outcomes payer role, if you remember that diagram, was a really important place to start the work, though we know that the ultimate success is going to require the insight, the reflections, and learning from providers, which is why all of you are here in the provider advisory group. So what have we been doing since we launched the cohort this summer? I know we talked a little bit about this when you all met us in Indianapolis, or some of you met us in Indianapolis. With the state and system cohort sites, we've been facilitating virtual meetings. We convened everyone in Indianapolis. We've been leading teams through some takeaway exercises that help each site explore Pay for Success feasibility as it relates to their context and with stakeholders. And to date, teams have reviewed some baseline data to understand where there's the greatest outcomes disparity. We've honed in on some of the outcomes of interest or focus at the state and systems level. Teams have conducted a root cause analysis to determine which kinds of student support services may best address the root causes generating those outcomes gaps. And all of this has helped states land on a population that they are interested in building a Pay for Success project around, where they, potentially as a systems level end payer, may actually pay on the outcomes achieved. As you can see on this slide, each site has selected a potential student population and outcomes of focus. I'll share, and especially since this is being recorded, this is highly tentative, and it's still in draft or hypothesis mode, but right now it's our best guess in partnership with cohort sites on where teams may focus their project and where they'll start to develop some of those stakeholder relationships to help them refine and dig deeper. As I go through the diagram, you'll recognize this is not precisely a one-to-one match of where sites are focused or where providers in this advisory group have experience. That's both in terms of geography, but also population. But I'll share that our cohort is exploring Pay for Success, and we think that those conclusions in this work will inform not only how to build toward a project, but the process may help inform how other projects may be developed or replicated in the space. So where you may not see a one-to-one match on where the focus is, I think as Alicia started to talk through, there's benefits of this, and some of the understanding from Pay for Success can help us with learnings in the field. So quickly going through the diagram, you'll see that ASU currently has a focus on foster youth and particularly helping with post-secondary enrollment and the successful transition out of foster care. Colorado's Department of Higher Ed is currently focusing on adult students. They may also be of low income or students of color, and their goal is to help erase the attainment gaps and increase credential completion. In Connecticut, right now, we're focusing on a particular group of Latinx students in Eastern Connecticut, and within that region, helping on increased enrollment and persistence for regional universities and community colleges. And Ohio, they're focused right now on supporting adult veterans, particularly with enrollment in a post-secondary degree or certificate, which leads to that family-sustaining job. So again, this is our best guess and hypothesis right now, but you'll start to see that some of those core elements that we talked about and in some of the work we've already done has started to shape where the project would be focused.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're nearing the end of the webinar. Just want to make a note to get your questions ready. We're eager to answer them. But before we do that, I just wanted to provide a roadmap of where we're headed over the next 2.5 months. It's going to be a really exciting time. As you can see, there's a lot going on. Starting at the top in the gray boxes, we are beginning to explore tools in Pay for Success, so the term sheet, economic model, and procurement, and we'll be sharing templates of those tools moving forward. To complement your understanding of the tools, we have in green boxes some learning opportunities. These webinars will hopefully deepen your knowledge of PFS. I should note they are all optional and are meant to be a resource for you as part of this learning community. So feel free to tune in live, and if not, again, all sessions, including today's webinar, will be recorded and shared afterwards. Along the bottom in blue boxes are the one-on-one calls we scheduled to begin developing provider readiness assessments. You all expressed interest in this work to explore what it might take for you to access public dollars. So we'll be speaking to each one of you to build out that understanding of where you are and considerations for where you might go in that process. In mid-December, we'll be sharing those assessments with you and the Kresge Foundation, and at that time, we're happy to discuss possible next steps or recommendations if you're interested in further pursuing PFS. With that, that concludes the content for today. Again, thank you for your time and attention, and we are happy to open it up for questions. So feel free to unmute or type them in. So we saw one question come in. Have all public entities actually made the payments based on the outcomes in previous, thanks Paige, in previous Pay for Success contracts? Good question. I think it probably depends on the project, right? I think they all have different timelines. We mentioned that this is a fairly new field, so a lot of the projects that we've been involved with are actually still in progress and have not yet reached those long-term outcomes that we're hoping to measure. So it's, I think, a little hard to say right now.
But I will say to that question, just even based on the structure, it's something that we're exploring with the cohort right now of which public entities would be responsible for making outcomes payments. One of the questions we often ask is, where is the greatest or most direct financial value being actualized? And I think that in Pay for Success projects, you know, the structure is often designed around some of the answers to questions like that. I would say, though, that in a Pay for Success arrangement or in a Pay for Success contract, the agreed upon outcomes often include both payment and what we call process outcomes. So while there may be outcomes that are tracked or measured along the way, they may not always have payment tied to them. So back in that example that Alicia walked through, everything was tracked, but only the starred outcome payments were ones where there was actually a financial payment or value tied to it.
I think, Paige, the one other thing to clarify too is that in these projects, the upfront funding does all flow to the provider to invest in standing up and delivering those services, and then the contingent payments that are made on the back end between the systems level payer and the upfront funder contingent on outcomes, you know, those may or may not be made based on outcome success. And just in the examples of the 3 paper success projects that we listed on slides 16 and 17, those all have made some of their outcomes payments. As Alicia mentioned, those projects are still running, so we haven't seen the full breadth of outcomes payments being made, but in all 3 of these examples, at least some outcomes have been achieved and payments have been made, and they're, you know, on progress to reaching that success.
And I have a related question, if I may.
Please. Yeah, please.
So I'm Ken with Inside Track, and really appreciate this work, the performance-based funding ideas that it builds on as well. And one of the gaps or challenges that we've seen around performance-based funding in the past is programs that are designed to work on a PFS or PBF model that then, when they do transition to a, you know, say a legislature or someone else who is funding it, we know that that doesn't always come. So these programs are great examples of it being successful, but what are y'all's ideas? How are you building in that sort of commitment to put some skin in the game from the site side, so that if things are going well, that they, you know, are encouraged? Like, what is that encouragement, or, you know, what are the benefits for them if rather than just looking at it as even though it's successful, it's another initiative that we just can't take on right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can look to first answer some of the part of your first question. I think it's a great, honestly, it's a great question, and I don't know if we have all of the answers. I think it's a lot of why we're exploring this, and part of why we really then took the feasibility we did with UAspire and started really thinking about how this would work with the systems level payer in mind first, and which is really why the current iteration of the cohort has been designed in the way that it has, which that transition piece, the funding doesn't always come, as you mentioned, is part of the reason that most of the first part of our TA with each of the sites was really digging into where their current priorities are and where the state is focusing some of its resources and some of its, you know, financial or non-financial time and consideration, because I think that where we've seen this also have gaps and challenges in other areas is precisely for what you were talking to, and if we can hone in on where is the state priority and you know, where might there be resources more broadly than this project that we're working on developing, that may be part of the sustainable financing model that is built into not only this project, but then carries forth the work after. So I don't know if that helps answer some of the ideas that we have, but I do think that in terms of where we've taken this work and now working with the state or system level is hopefully helping us identify where there may be opportunities and really where the state priorities are to ensure that some of that sustainable financing is considered from the very beginning of developing these projects. In terms of, yeah, and I'm happy, you know, as we continue exploring this, you know, I think part of where we see this being more of a learning community or more of a learning environment is to help one another answer that question as well. And we recognize that higher ed particularly is a space that it differs so greatly from state to state, and some of the ways that performance-based funding either exists in large part or in some cases not at all across the country. And so we think that there's really an opportunity to use this model as a starting place for shaping where relationships continue to grow and develop within the field.
And I think there was an add-on to that question, which was, and does the financial model include money the system is saving due to the service provision?
Yeah, so I think there are lots of different ways to calculate that financial value that the system or even potentially systems are gaining as a result of interventions and ultimately improved outcomes. So that cost savings that the system might be accruing, you know, in the example Alicia shared of Massachusetts juvenile justice of prevented recidivism, that's certainly something that was calculated and baked into that economic model, and we could consider cost savings in terms of these higher ed models as well. But we are really working with sites to think about calculating financial value, both in terms of cost savings as well as in terms of financial benefit gained through, as we mentioned, performance-based funding formulas, through additional dollars that students bring with them in the form of Pell Grants or other kind of scholarship dollars, as well as thinking about if there are financial benefits related to other social benefits that result from more students matriculating, persisting, and graduating from college. So ultimately, it's kind of an art, not a science, in terms of how all these outcomes payments get calculated, but those types of considerations are all baked into the economic model and then used in the kind of negotiation that carries forward from there.
The other things that I'll just add to that response is, you know, we recognize for many providers in this space that there isn't currently a direct path for sustainable financing, and realize that cost savings cannot be and maybe should not be the exclusive way to be developing these contracts, because in reality it may take more upfront funding to get the project off the ground than in other spaces, in other related spaces. And I'll note that in a lot of our projects, sometimes the way that the calculations are developed, and this is why we hope to feature tools or be referring to some tools in this space, sometimes in the first year or several years in a project's development, it may actually cost more money as the project is gaining efficiency and recycling or reusing some funds back into the project, reinvesting resources back into the project. So while there may be some cost savings due to the service provision, there may be also scenarios where a service provider who's exploring something new or trying to scale or sustain something that's worked in a typical environment, you know, there may actually be some additional cost on the upfront of these projects before they actually get going. So to HK's point, it being more of an art than a science, I think that the stakeholder relationships and the unique nature of this cross-sector kind of project really allows voices of all stakeholders to influence and shape how projects come together. Are there any other questions that folks are kind of marinating on, or if anyone on the line has other thoughts or reflections to add about kind of their experience in the space?
Just one other, and on that idea that you just shared of, you know, that it's not a science, or that there are sciences to it, but it's arts and sciences, and how you tell the story and actually look more broadly. We've also, and I'm sure some of the other providers have experienced examples where programs stem losses that are being experienced across a system or across a whole sector of higher education. You know, we all know that there's a demographic cliff coming for the traditional age students, for example. And if you can slow enrollment losses, you might not demonstrate huge gains on enrollment when you're talking about historically high on enrollment from the second baby boom just not existing anymore. So you're stemming those losses and helping somebody get to whatever the new right size is, as opposed to, you know, becoming the next ASU online or someone like that. You know, so that's another caution or important part of a story, depending on what your population that you're serving can be, is not just what's the historical baseline for the school, the system, or the program, but also what are the trend lines inside that system and you know, across to other related systems, so that you can see, like, are we actually, would without our service things have gone, you know, would that sharper decline have happened, and then you're actually saving more money because you're not losing as much money.
No, I think that narrative that you tell is really important, and oftentimes in our work we'll refer to that as our counterfactual. And I think, you know, it relates to some of the comments that you raised earlier, and part of why we're starting with the state and system is to think about, you know, focusing on a student population that not only grounded in some of that historical baseline, but based on some of their strategic plans or other kinds of initiatives where this would help complement that, which is why I find it unique on that chart that talked to where each of the sites are currently focused. This really is, you know, very customized and specific to the unique nature of what's happening in that jurisdiction. And why we think that exploring these types of projects and really starting with some core components of pay for success, or understanding the feasibility of pay for success, not only to your language starts to tell that story better, but also gives the stakeholders involved in this project an opportunity to align on common goals, to share, you know, what they're seeing in the space, or what information is currently telling them, so that there can be baked in these projects those anticipated kind of programmatic things that may come around. So you talked to the demographic cliff, and I think, as you'll notice, 2 of the sites are really focused on adult students, and I think a lot of that is because of some of the analysis and some of the work that they've done at the state level to really anticipate what's coming. So I think great point that you made, and another reason why we think that sometimes aligning on the tools or just having common understanding of what everyone's doing actually will help, you know, sites, providers, other future projects kind of take shape as the unique needs emerge in communities.
The other thing I would just add to that is also the benefit of having an external evaluator here and participating in either a quasi-experimental or experimental study as a part of this pay for success arrangement can also help to tell that story that you mentioned of, you know, understanding what macroeconomic factors are also contributing to this, you know, change in outcomes, and being able to isolate to some extent, you know, the impact that the program is having. So I think that's a benefit we're even seeing, you know, and having discussions around right now in the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Project, where the overall rate of young men recidivating in the Commonwealth is falling at the same time, you know, that this program is serving those hardest to reach young men. And that's where some of that evaluation and those multi-stakeholder conversations around what you're seeing in the data can really help inform that story that's then being told as a result of the project.
I guess before having Alicia wrap up, if there are no other questions, do just want to add that we're really excited for the group that's, you know, convened around this initiative. I know she shared that slide with everyone's logos, and please let us know if we got any of them wrong. But I think just generally, we're really excited to experiment and explore these kinds of conversations with all of you, and we'll be happy to dig in more on those one-on-one calls forthcoming. But even some of the narrative that was shared both in the questions and you know, what we've started to understand in your RFIs, I think is helping us gain more clarity on where this tool really can be leveraged, where there are opportunities. And I think as we continue to assess where there might be gaps and challenges, and bringing unique stakeholders together to start to answer some of those questions. So I just want to say that I'm really excited and appreciate you all joining us.
Great. And with that, I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you again for joining us and for being so engaged. and we will talk to all of you next week or the week after for your one-on-ones. Thanks and have a great afternoon.